Well, Colonel Brendan Kearney is a military affairs analyst and a former chief of staff for the US Marine Corps forces in Europe. And we can speak to him now. Good evening to you, Colonel Kearney.
Thanks, Carole. Good evening to you.
Really good to have you with us. Let me ask you, first of all, about President Biden's visit to Kiev. How important do you think it was?
Well, I think from a symbolic perspective, it certainly is important. You know, it provides a tangible level of commitment on the part of the United States towards Ukraine. And again, also it reinforces that commitment to our Western European allies. It's in my mind, better late than never. And quite frankly, I do view this as late, probably by about 6 months. But again, it's good that he did it.
And of course, he is, as US president, always surrounded by extraordinary extent of security, and to undertake a 10-hour train journey, and he is a president of 80 years old, it is quite something, isn't it?
It's not easy. I don't envy him that trip. I can remember taking an overnight train from Chisinau in Moldova to Kiev many years ago, and even though it was an overnight train, it was longer. It's not pleasant. Eastern European railways they're not like you get in Western Europe, which are probably among the best in the world. So I got to hand it to him. Not an easy way for an 80-year-old man to spend a day figuring 10 hours going and 10 hours coming back.
And what did you make of these reports that apparently the Russians were actually warned in advance about this trip?
You know, it's actually a very prudent move, and it's something that the West has done for a number of years in a variety of conflict areas. Most recently, and I believe still occurring today, is Russian efforts in Syria. They've got quite an air contingent over there, and they and the U.S. And some of the other coalition forces that are present over there that fly air operations do routinely advise each other that they're going to have aircraft in the air precisely to avoid any mischance that aircraft may be involved in combat. And I think when you're talking about Air Force One or a train moving across from Poland into Kiev, it's probably a wise move, and I'm glad the Russians ostensibly respected it, as we've had certainly no reports of any attempts to interdict the presidential movement.
Yeah, because, I mean, it does show not only that there are channels of communication open with the Kremlin, but also, I mean, a degree of trust that the Russians would not abuse that information, and that for all their apparent brutality and lack of concern for human life, that they wouldn't want to actually make a mistake when it comes to the President of the United States.
I completely agree with your assessment. It would be catastrophic if they had done something, particularly in light of the overt effort on the part of the United States to notify them in advance.
What about these requests that we're hearing for the West to send jets?
You know, it's an interesting... I'm ambivalent, to be honest with you, and I come from an organization, spent 31 years in the Marine Corps, where we have a very integrated, our own little mini Air Force, so to speak, in Marine Corps aviation, we train on a consistent basis, using them in offensive and defensive operations. It would certainly give an advantage to the Ukrainians. Because no one since the very beginning of this, almost a year ago, has had command of the air. It's been a toss-up between the Russians and the Ukrainians. Quite honestly, there's been a lot of open source reporting that the Russian Air Force simply does not want to fly over Ukraine, which is one of the reasons they've been relying so much on these unmanned aerial vehicles or drones. So, you know, I've got to think this through even further. I'm kind of the opinion that this might be unnecessarily provocative. We've walked a tightrope with Russia, and maybe this is not the smartest move to do.
Yeah, because the NATO and its allies at the outset were very wary about what they were going to send. Then they did start sending more and more sophisticated air defense systems. Then they weren't going to send tanks. Now we are sending tanks, including the US sending tanks. But President Zelensky is very clear that the jets, the combat aircraft, that is what he needs. And that would presumably require the US to give its say-so.
I think so. So much of the aircraft over there are either of U.S. origin or they use U.S. software. And since the countries that we're primarily talking about are all members of NATO, those aircraft are primarily designed to operate within the NATO standards of aviation command and control. It's an extraordinarily complex system. I don't think we would ship that along with the aircraft to Ukraine, but this would give a leg up to the Ukrainians. That would be just an extraordinary step forward in their overall military capability. But again, it's such a big step that the provocation to Russia is going to be at a level that is far beyond what's been done so far. So if we're going to do it, it's going to have to be very, very well thought through. There's going to have to certainly be an agreement within the West because everybody will suffer the repercussions of this is a miscalculation on the part of the West.
So you think that there is a risk then that if the West did send jets, that they could be drawn into a direct confrontation with Russia?
I do think so. I think the Russians are going to have to react in some manner, way, shape, or form. They've certainly blustered and postured over the other things that we've done here in the past, as you described just a few minutes ago, with those things we said no initially to the Ukrainian request, and then we followed through. The most recent one being the tanks. But again, this is a step up in capability that could prove devastating to the Russian military. And again, this requires probably a great deal more thought and more deliberation, more coordination between the U.S. and its Western allies throughout NATO to clearly discuss in a very careful manner. Because I think it will necessarily prompt some type of Russian reaction. I don't know what that would be. As opposed at one level it would be a complete reaction against NATO and the West. The other point might be a further escalation in the war against the Ukrainian people.
What about the role of China? Because we saw at the weekend at the Munich Security Conference these warnings from Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, that he feared that China might be about to get more directly involved in terms of helping the Russians with the armaments and so on that they want.
Quite honestly, I think the Chinese have been doing it surreptitiously since the very beginning. I think, they have an extraordinarily long border with Russia, and getting equipment, particularly munitions, across that border would not be difficult. You would think that the West would probably pick that up on satellite imagery and things like that, but maybe not particularly so, or the fact we know it, but we've chosen not to go ahead and publicize it. I think, if anything, this would just be an increase, a more overt increase in what they've already been doing. The Chinese have a long history of going ahead and providing munitions and equipment and even personnel. It dates back to the Korean War, dates back to the Vietnam War. This is part of their history, so it doesn't surprise me. And again, the Chinese can do it with some impunity, because what is the West going to do? Are we going to get mad at them and say, and hold our breath and stomp our feet type response? Because that's really what we've seen the Chinese, in reaction to Chinese provocations here over the last number of years.
Just finally, Friday, it will be a year since that big invasion into Ukraine by Russian forces. Clearly, the war has not gone as President Putin had hoped, as President Biden was remarking today. But do you think, from what you've seen, that he is, President Putin, preparing some renewed offensive to mark this year into the conflict?
I do. I think he very badly wants to achieve some type of military success. I believe he's already launched his offensive. However, I believe it's like most of the, or virtually all of the Russian military offensive operations that we've seen over this almost full year, in the sense that it is ineffective, poorly coordinated, conducted by troops that are poorly trained, poorly equipped, and extraordinarily poorly led. So I believe it's ongoing, and I think it's probably going to have essentially the same results that we've seen over the last year in that ever-increasing Russian casualties within their military, and more damage, more death and destruction rained upon the Ukrainian people that are in resistance.
Col Brendan Kearney, military affairs analyst, a former chief of staff for the US Marine Corps forces in Europe. Really good to speak to you. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much. Good luck to you.